Welcome to Part Assistant, and today I'm with RJ Houston. How are you going, RJ?
Good. How are you, David?
Yeah, I'm doing very well today, actually, and we'll talk about that in a second. But a little bit about you. So, RJ is the National Manager Aquatics at Royal Life Saving Australia. RJ started in the aquatic industry over 17 years ago as a lifeguard and swim teacher, and has worked in roles across local government, non-for-profit, and peak bodies. Previous to his role, RJ worked as a facility manager and a statewide manager with responsibility for industry events, coordination, and advocacy. In particular, RJ has maintained a focus on compliance, safety, and risk management framework for the aquatic sector, developing and executing statewide risk management strategies for the aquatic industry and the aquatic recreation sector. Now, RJ has studied and holds various qualifications in legal studies, policy work, health and safety, emergency management, project management, incident investigations, lead auditing, and business administration. And you're currently studying a master's in business administration, specialising in social impact at the Australian Graduate School of Management at the University of New South Wales. It's a pretty long bio there, mate.
It's a bit of a mouthful, yeah. Sorry.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's great to get a bit more information on, your background. So we'll kick straight in. So what does well-being mean to you?
Look, from my personal perspective, I guess it's about being sort of healthy, happy, and fulfilled.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty sharp. And unpack that a bit for me.
So, yeah, I mean, how long is a piece of string? Yeah, I suppose for everyone, like what well-being is really subjective, right? So, there's people that, that they might feel that it's being really fit, or it might be, being, having time for creativity, and it might be having time for connection, those types of things, or a blend, probably a blend, a holistic kind of model. But for me, it's really, getting, balancing all the little dials and sort of being in some sort of place where I've got a good mix of things that kind of help me feel healthy. My mental health is in a good place. My physical health is in a reasonable place. It seems to be the first one to get put on the back burner. But then just happiness comes from sort of connection. And then the fulfillment for me is really about purpose and, what gets me out of bed every day. And if I don't have a good kind of mix of all of those types of things, I probably don't feel as well as I could be, but at the moment I'm feeling great. So
yeah, and I like it that you touched on purpose there, RJ. So tell us a little bit about that and yeah, how that's rolled into your story.
Yeah. So do you want to sort of hear about the story or just about purpose in general?
Whatever comes up for you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I suppose these days, so I'm quite fortunate in the sense that I'm working for a national organization, works in drowning prevention, and the work that I'm doing kind of contributes to influencing a sector and which has a huge amount of impact across Australia. Across nearly every community there's a swimming pool, and so in some ways they're sort of connected to the work that goes on in that place, or that goes on in our workplace, and so it's it's really kind of it's exciting and challenging all at once to be able to kind of help bring people together to solve problems and to kind of influence the sector in terms of its thinking and how it creates more inclusive environments or safer environments, or it increases its impact in the community. So that's giving me a lot of purpose in the sense of feeling really happy about what I do has a really meaningful impact. And you can't do everything in life, right? So we probably all start out when we're younger sort of thinking that we're going to change the world, but to kind of be able to just change whatever it is within your sphere of influence, I think is something that's really something to be celebrated. And no matter how big or small that sphere of influence is, sort of getting up and thinking about how you can kind of make things better than where you found them should kind of motivate people. I've always taken that approach, no matter how big or small the scope's been, and I've found that the scope has grown as I've adopted that approach and just kept moving, right? I guess, yeah, like if you want to hear a bit about my background. So initially I was working in the ski and snowboard industry, and I really enjoyed that for a period of time. I got injured a lot. So at some stage I was sort of like very high level coaching for snowboarders and teaching people how to become snowboard instructors and that kind of thing. And that was a lot of fun. I used to travel around Western Canada and a little bit New Zealand, Australia, training people to become snowboard instructors and training all sorts of people in snowboarding. At some stage I was training the Australian Defence Force snowboard and ski team, because I assume that they have to have some capability for snow deployments and things like that. So that's pretty interesting. And that was a lot of fun. And then I was at uni as well, studying sort of law, politics, and I was working as a lifeguard as well in and around skiing and whatever else, and swim teacher, duty manager, that kind of thing, and running little outdoor pools over the summer when there was no snow. And I just kept getting offered roles in management, which I eventually took up. So even when I was at uni, I think I was working as a team leader. So, 3-4 days a week as a team leader, and then 2-3 days a week at uni. So that was that was at the YMCA at the time. Really fortunate to have a pretty flexible kind of employer there, and really enjoyed that time. And then I sort of worked around a bunch of facilities and kind of worked out doors were kind of opening in this in the aquatic industry, and what I was studying was kind of, it was great in terms of informing my thinking and structuring ideas and a way of thinking, particularly law and risk thinking and kind of systems. But I just wanted to kind of continue in sort of aquatic facility management and working in the industry. I've just really enjoyed it. People, the work, lots of variety. So I did that for quite a few years, local government, YMCA, sort of at the City of Yarra in Melbourne, if you're familiar with it, sort of very progressive council, lots of really progressive programs and types of things, which we can talk about too. And then I ended up sort of getting asked to work in a life-saving body, a state body, so Life-Saving Victoria, working on aquatic industry kind of programs and events and pool safety generally, like how to bring the sector together and increase the safety within the industry, which is a pretty good track record as it is, but it's more about continuing to sort of evolve and improve that. And I found that really enjoyable. It was a really great role. Really lots of opportunity to expand impact and things like that. And then kind of COVID hit, and the industry's been on its knees in Victoria in some respects over that period, and they're really just kind of trying to get out of it now. But a role came up at Royal Life Saving to sort of try and extend what I was doing, on a more sort of national scale, and that when I was talking about purpose earlier, that was kind of a no-brainer for me about purpose and expanding impact and having a greater impact as an individual. So that was kind of a great alignment there. And I've been at Royal Life Saving Australia for about 1.5 years.
Yeah, cool. It's quite broad, that, RJ. Starting in skiing and snowboarding, and then you're obviously now working in aquatics kind of full time. But what are some of the main differences between those kind of roles? Because I mean, you've got the snow and you're on the out, and then you're in the water. So
Well, like I think about the nature of those two industries, and they're very similar in some respects. You've got members of the public essentially coming in to an environment that's got inherent hazards, but it's full of fun, right? And it's really enjoyable, and so people want to be there. People like taking risks, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got industries around that trying to kind of manage those risks, right?
Yeah.
And also market them and create, structured risks and things like that. So a lot of similarities, a lot of young people working in the industries.
Yeah.
And people that it's kind of like, it's also kind of seen as a lifestyle industry. If you're in employment there. So if you're a swim teacher, for example, it's because you like working with kids and you care about people and making them safe and things like that, or their development. If you're a lifeguard, you might be kind of I don't know, I'm sort of aggregating here, generalizing, but typical kind of oldest child, I'm responsible and I want to, keep people safe and, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or you might just sort of want kind of a role in sort of health and fitness and helping people feel good. And, skiing and snowboarding and those types of industries is probably very similar. There's probably a little bit more partying goes on,
Yeah.
I think, in
Yes.
resorts.
So I've heard.
There was a lot of that. But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, both places. And they're great, they're great industries to work in. I certainly enjoyed my time in both of those industries.
Yeah. And obviously there's risks in both, isn't there? Flying down a ski slope and then water being life-threatening as well. So a lot of risk management, and you've obviously got a lot of experience in health and safety and incident investigations and so. So I suppose that's been built over time. But from an inclusion perspective, I'm just curious around like skiing and snowboarding. Like, have you got any examples of initiatives or projects or clients that that you kind of work with?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like, for example, right, in the US there was a documentary a couple of years ago that came out called Blacks Can't Swim.
Sorry, Blacks Can't
Swim, yeah.
Right,
And it was about African Americans, and how how swimming pools are structured in the US. A lot of them are in like residential compounds and they're typically white communities and that kind of thing. And so there's kind of a culture in the US of like African Americans not knowing how to swim, not feeling welcome in swimming pools, and because of segregation and all of that, up well into the 60s, and in some states, still some deeply entrenched sort of racial intolerances. So there's that kind of thing going on. But in the ski industry, it's sort of similar, right? In a way, in that it's cost prohibitive too, and some communities, particularly lower socioeconomic communities, those types of things can't access it by nature of its cost. But at the same time, like, if both industries in some respects need to continue to grow and expand not just their impact, but also their markets if they're for profit, and so increasing diversity and inclusion is necessary, absolutely necessary for their survival. And if you think about sort of demographic changes around the world and those types of things, the expansion of these types of industries is really in sort of China and India and that type of thing too, right? So having multicultural, inclusive kind of focus is really important. And like I sort of think back on it in Vancouver when I was living there. There was a huge Korean community used to come across to work in to get snowboard instructor qualifications. I'm not sure if I told you this, but so I had a colleague who was Korean, and he just sort of mentioned, I've got this Korean website and I put up a video of you snowboarding, and there's all these comments. These people want to come over and learn how to become a snowboard instructor like you in from Korea, and like, can we go and approach the peak body about running Korean programs? And so we basically kind of went and did this sort of partnership between let's call them a tourism provider, and the Canadian Association of Snowboard Instructors, who I was working for at the time, and the local ski resort. And it was like a little a boot camp as such, of sort of bringing Korean people over, teaching them about snowboard instruction and teaching and all those types of things, and to kind of pass the course, like, you had to be able to kind of communicate mostly in English, a lot of nonverbal communication in that field as well, but sort of working with them through the terminology and those types of things to get them through the course, like a pre-course almost, to get them through the course. And that was really fun. Like, that was really cool. But it was a whole new market for the Canadian Association of Snowboard Instructors, and now they run programs in Korea. They send trainers over there, and they run things over there. And there's and not just them, but I think the Australian Ski Instructor Peak Association, APSI, I think they're called. They go over there, and a range of others. Japan's got a bunch of stuff from Canada and Australia and whatever else in their own system. So really interesting in that space. And then likewise, I think in our little world of sort of aquatics and that type of thing, it's very topical. Like, we've got a increasingly diverse population, multicultural communities. If we look at our kind of economic levers that the government can kind of pull to continue to, underpin our property market and employment and all those types of things, it has to be immigration. Constant, like it's we live in a desirable place to live, so it's got to be immigration, and that means catering to those communities, and it also means having staff in your facilities that reflect those communities and are able to kind of create networks with those communities as well. So lots of opportunity, actually. I find that really exciting.
Yeah,
sort of change to come, right?
I like it how you finish with this opportunity, and that's exactly right. That's the way I like to look at it. And you touched on before, RJ, around coming out of COVID for the industry. And what do you see some of the kind of hot topics, challenges right now as we're coming out of it?
Yeah. So look, there's a couple of sort of main ones, and there's some periphery ones as well. So I think like the access, inclusion, diversity conversation, we need to have that conversation. It's been on pause because of COVID. Child safety, it has been on pause because of COVID as well. We've seen regulations come out in New South Wales and strengthening of the regulations in Victoria in the last 12 months. So there's a conversation that needs to happen around child safety and preventing child harm and child abuse, those types of things. There is a conversation about increasing access, inclusion, diversity, that type of thing. And again, like particularly, if we think about some of our most vulnerable communities, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, access to swimming and swimming lessons and life-saving programs is still, still very, very poor. Like there's not enough support for those communities, and there's not enough infrastructure for those communities.
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of like longer term issues. Another longer term issue is infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be releasing a report very, very soon without sort of preempting all the content of that report. But there's a high percentage of pools around the country that were built in the 60s and 70s after the Melbourne Olympics through state and federal funding. They talked about like the ribbon of blue, outside of the, in regional centers, this ribbon of blue, like to get, every town was going to have the next Olympian kind of scenario. And there's a lot of spending there. And then the maintenance of that sort of fell to local government. Some of them are very small local governments, and they haven't had the resources to maintain those assets, but the community really value them. Very hot and dry, dusty country we are. And so, a swimming pool is not just it's not just about like, having a place of, it is this, but it's not just this place of connection and recreation, but it's also like community relief and heat relief, and sometimes there are evacuation centers and things like that around fires or the floods. Like a lot of those aquatic facilities were used as community relief centers, and they became the hub where people were getting food and supplies and blankets and things like that, particularly up in Lismore. And so they're really critical, like social infrastructure. And that high percentage of pools that were built in the 60s and 70s are now at the end of their life.
Mm-hmm.
And we need another wave of spending, essentially, to make sure that those are either maintained, replaced, or something to transition those kind of critical services is in place for those communities, without preempting what that looks like for every community. In some places it might be that the pool has to close. In some places it might be that there's a bus that takes them to another place. Like we've got to figure these problems out. So those are kind of the longer term issues.
Can I just ask a question there, Ajay, on the infrastructure? So, because obviously that asset renewal, some of that will be compliance, to make sure it's up to certain standards, and then obviously things just need upgrading as time goes on. Do you have a quantum on how much that's like costs for if you've done this type of work? Because I'm sure it's millions and millions of dollars. Yeah.
Higher. Yeah, we're doing that right now. So we're still working out the economic number, the final number. We've got to triangulate from a range of sort of data sources.
Yeah.
And we could, like, obviously being a small kind of non-profit organization, we've got less than 15 employees. Like we can't go out and assess the age of every facility, but we're taking a series of case studies and a statistically significant sample size.
Mm-hmm.
And we're taking a range of kind of like infrastructure assessments and reports and using these to triangulate, kind of estimate kind of a figure that would be, acceptable or tolerable to the government to kind of go, yeah, that's a fairly accurate assessment. And it'll be a bit of a range, right? So if they've been well maintained, likely this figure. If they've been not so well maintained, but not completely derelict, this. And if they've had no spending, then it's this. So it'll be a range. But it's in the billions. It's not in the millions. You know, it's very, very high. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. That's the issue, right? And so those are long-term issues, complex problems that need to be addressed. But we've got some really acute, equally wicked problems going on that are being felt extremely hard right now with long-term consequences too.
Tell me.
I don't mean to be the town crier ringing the alarm bells and everyone, you know, the sky is falling, Chicken Little, but it's the reality. And so the first one, which is kind of critical from an industry perspective, but from our perspective especially, is children missing out on swimming and life-saving skills. And that's been a long-term issue that's been going on for a long time. There's always been kids missing out, low socioeconomic, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly remote communities, regional and remote communities. There's been a long-term trend there forever, particularly after the age of 8, swim lesson participation drops off. Landlocked communities or communities on rivers, there's not a lot of programs that transition people from, you know, young child swim lessons into open water environments. And just because you can swim in a 0.7 meter deep, 15 meter long pool doesn't mean you can swim in the Murray River, for example. It's been the #1 drowning hotspot in the country for decades, right? So that's kind of that's an example. But with the context of COVID, we've had 2 years of lockdowns, basically in New South Wales and Victoria in particular. And even in the other jurisdictions, like there's been kind of stop, start. And that uncertainty has meant that parents haven't enrolled their children because they're just like the inconvenience of the whole thing too, right? And you can kind of relate to that. So we've done a calculation. We think that 10 million swim lessons were missed over the pandemic. So if you think about, you know, a child's physical health, emotional, social development, as well as their like swim competency and drowning prevention competency, 10 million lessons were missed. That's 10 million times that, you know, children missed out on gaining those skills and competence.
But how many, in terms of that 10 million, is that like one enrollment would have 10 swimming lessons? So, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's not 10 million children, because those maths don't quite work out, but it's the amount of lessons that children missed. So let's call them half-hour, 45-minute long lessons, and that includes things like the vacation programs that we see happening, the school-based swimming programs, and let's call them the market-based lessons that, you know, after school and on weekends that parents go and do. And it's just in relation to we know roughly what happens in the ecosystem on a
And on that then, RJ, we're against the clock, I suppose, because, you know, we're not going to see the effects of that, are we? For a while, you know, when you look at, I don't like saying the D word, but drowning rates, you know, and people have not having lessons now, you know, it's a worry for the future, isn't it?
Yeah. So you kind of got to do the maths on this stuff, and so and this kind of there's a second major issue here that's compounding the first issue. So essentially, we've also got the workforce issues, right? And that's every sector right now. The workforce is spread really thin. And there's employment data, I think, coming out from the federal government today. This is sort of the 20th of May. So we'll have a really good picture of what that looks like across the entire economy. But for aquatics, what that means is, you know, it's an industry that was one of, if not the most impacted by closures, you know, maybe that and sort of, you know, concerts and festivals. And so those closures associated with health rules. So the kids who missed out on swim lessons, not only have they missed out for 2 years, but they can't get into swim lessons because there's not enough staff to service those. So there's pools around Melbourne that have, you know, year-long wait lists for a child to get in. So you think they've missed 2 years, they're going to miss a third. If you kind of profile this around a case study, that's, you know, a 3-year-old at the start of the pandemic. They're now sort of 5 or 6, so getting, you know, 5.5. They've got to wait another year to get into a swim lesson. And then we know the long-term trend is that participation in swim lessons drops off at the age of 8. So you've got a bunch of kids who will never, may never is probably a better way of putting it, may never learn to swim at all. And so that results in this, higher lifetime risk and the generational impacts of a generation of kids who never learned how to swim, in particularly acute in New South Wales and Victoria, right?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking to hear that, RJ. When you step it out like that, it's a generational impact, isn't it? Unfortunately,
Yeah.
and it's like, what can we do, collectively across the system to try and negate, what's the inevitable, really. So yeah, and the employment aspect is really interesting. So particularly when you talked before around having a workforce that reflects the demographic of, the areas and stuff. And is there anything, any particular projects or objectives kind of through Royal Life as what you're trying to do to address the employment and training crisis that we've got?
Yeah, so we chair like an industry. We call it the National Aquatic Industry Committee. It's probably a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it brings together all of the sector, and it's a cross-sectional stakeholder model. So it's not a representative from every organization out there, but from types of organizations. So management agencies that might manage publicly owned aquatic and leisure facilities, like the YMCA. Your listeners probably would have heard of them, or owners of aquatic facilities like local government, state-based associations, swimming organizations like Swimming Australia, building associations, and peak bodies, that kind of thing, spas, those types of entities, swim teacher training providers and lifeguard training providers, and sort of a range of stakeholders around the country, and life-saving organizations. And that group comes together. They're actually meeting in a couple of weeks. And one, we're looking at all of these issues, but two, there's kind of an advocacy agenda here as well. So last year we did a lot of advocacy around the impact of the aquatic industry, which I can tell you a bit about if your listeners would be interested. But essentially, for, let's say, with swimming skills and workforce issues, we're taking a snapshot of the workforce pre and post COVID. We've done pre, obviously, and post COVID, and we're looking at the ecosystem for delivery of Learn to Swim and the range of interventions that exist to get children in. And we'll be advocating how we can strengthen existing interventions and co-design new interventions to help get those kids that are missing out or at risk of missing out back into swimming and lifesaving. And then try and reverse some of these longer term trends, like this drop off at age 7. Like there's some community education that needs to happen around the importance of not just being able to swim, but also learning to swim until you reach the benchmarks, which is more or less swimming for 50 meters and being able to float for 2 minutes. And you can't do that if you just learn how to swim as a toddler in a very shallow pool. You've got to transition your knowledge into bigger environments, deeper environments, and then get it out into moving water and open water. So life-saving programs, we would call that. Like there's some great programs around the country, Outback Lifesavers and Nippers, surf program, getting kids out into the surf and using different equipment and pulling each other out and learning CPR. Like that's really important, right? So so that they can be little community champions as well. And then I think we've talked before, David, there's a range of like refugee programs and things like that about getting migrant groups and, those that kind of identified at higher risk into, beach safety and water safety programs and river safety programs, and getting them through a sort of a pipeline of becoming lifeguards and placed in the industry and, pathway programs. So we really need to bridge the gap between like Learn to Swim from what the market is sort of saying needs to happen, which is get your 4 to 6 year old or 4 to 8 year old into swim lessons because you want to prevent drowning. It's like, yeah, that's a great first step, but step 2 is like pathway programs and getting them into the benefits of swimming for life and aquatic recreation, then pathways into other aquatic based recreation type of things, whether that's surfing or canoeing or whatever it is, water polo, things that make people healthier and happier for life, actually. That, they need to be able to swim before they can do all of those activities, boating, fishing, so many recreational activities in Australia. The prerequisite is being able to swim, right? So it's not just about the generational impacts of drowning, it's generational impacts of like leisure and well-being and health, mental health, all those types of things. So
Jeez, it's overwhelming, RJ, like in terms of all the different intersection points to try and get people to swim, and all the different strategies that you're kind of working on, from workforce or education and the community advocacy. So yeah, you've got your work cut out, but I think it like you said before, it's about working with all these different stakeholders, and sectors, isn't it? Collectively with that shared purpose. Because as you said, we're a water-based country, and just moving it along a little bit in terms of chronic disease within Australia. As you know, 1 in 2's got a chronic disease. It's getting worse. So if you could nudge one part of the system to improve the well-being of Australians, RJ, what would that be for you?
Yeah, it's such a big question, right? We've obviously the discourse around health over the last 2 years have been really dominated by this thing called COVID. I can't remember much about it. But,
what's that?
and we've got to reinvigorate these other conversations. I think there's been a little bit of discussion about mental health in the election that's going on right now. I know we all get to make our decision very, very quickly here, but there's a massive crisis of mental health, right? And so I said we did some research last year into the health, social, economic value of the industry. So we know just generally, broadly, physical activity, for example, this is just one part of the solution. Like there's a whole spectrum of mental health conditions. But for example, there's a stack of research pushed out by Harvard and others about physical activity and the reduction in chronic mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. It's about 25%, right? So if that's one thing that everyone can kind of do is just get more physically active, that's a pretty big impact on 2 of the main sort of chronic mental health conditions that people are suffering in the community. And I've certainly found over my life as well it's been a help. It's not a silver bullet. Like I think, we definitely get advocates out there saying, if everyone just exercised, there wouldn't be any depression. It's not how it works. If you've been gone through trauma and tragedy and whatever else, like you can't, just exercise that out of your system, right? You need support services and a systems-based approach to solving that, or managing it, right? But I think, like in terms of the preventative benefits for a lot of people, it's pretty significant. And so our role is to help kind of advocate the benefits of aquatic-based activity. We're big champions of that. Water-loving nation free from drowning is our mission. And so we want people out there enjoying the water, doing it safely, but really getting the benefits out of that. And so a lot of our advocacy is sort of targeted to policymakers in particular about the aquatic industry, aquatic facilities, and creating conditions that support communities to be healthy and happier. And then obviously sort of at a more granular level, the facilities themselves and what's included in facilities, we see a lot more focus on things like sensory rooms and programs for people with ASD and access for people with disabilities, and ensuring that there's equitable access and those types of things. And simple things like pricing and concessions and off-peak memberships and having opportunities for people and transgender friendly programs and change rooms and all types of things. There's such a spectrum of things for these community facilities where they can be really welcoming and inclusive and get more people active and healthier. And it's a whole community thing, right? So like when we were doing the research last year, which I haven't really talked about, but in the scoping for the research, I went and visited quite a few aquatic facilities local to me, and there was one facility that stuck out. In one lane, we had a group of older women doing aqua aerobics, and they were, I say women, there was probably a couple of men in there too, and they were in sort of elderly years, and and that was the only form of physical activity that they enjoyed, one. But two, for some of them, like morbidly obese or chronic health conditions, there it was the only kind of physical activity full stop that was available to them, right?
Right.
Because of the low impact nature of the aqua aerobics. So there was that was in one lane, and the next lane over we had an Olympic hopeful training for the Olympics, because it was going back just before the Tokyo Olympics. And then in the next lane over, we had a group of mums and bubs doing their infant aquatic lessons or swim lessons, and so we had the whole kind of like range of the whole life cycle, I suppose, of physical activity in one 25-meter pool, from elite athlete to infants and mums and bubs, and it was kind of in the middle of the day, and then we had these sort of older Australians as well, and there's not a lot of programs or community infrastructure that can have that full life cycle of people being engaged in health and well-being simultaneously in the same space at the same time, like a swimming pool. So I've got a little bias for swimming pools, if you haven't picked that up. But
I want to give this pool, or whoever managed, it was the operating manager, a shout out, because I think that's incredible, and that's what we want for our facilities, right? Used by the whole community, and doesn't matter what population or group you're from. So which facility was it? Come on.
So that was Ascot Vale Leisure Centre, and Grant Connors was the manager down there at the time. Like, you'd probably be familiar with Grant from your time.
Yeah.
Belgravia, he's at Belgravia.
Yeah.
And like, critically, the Moonee Valley City Council has structured their tender for their facilities based around outcomes, not outputs.
Yeah.
So it's not like a lease style tender. It's we want you to target these 12 target populations. You tell us how much it costs to do that.
Yeah.
And we'll pay for that. It's not you run this facility as you see fit,
Yeah.
which is going to lend itself. I'm not saying it does always lend itself to this, but it can leave the door open to running facilities based on what's profitable, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a management sort of arrangement. So I think that kind of system is a little bit more progressive, and it's a bit fairer as well for the parties, because sometimes, I've been on both sides of that table where you're a contract, you're a contractor, and then I've also been the sort of on the other side of the table where you're a council, you're engaging contractors, and it's kind of hard for both parties too sometimes when it's a bit like when there's not a lot of clarity. So I think that kind of model is really progressive in the sense of, let's talk about impact, right? And then let's work out how much it costs to do that and how we can kind of co-facilitate this in a fair way. And I think they've got a really good relationship there, from what I understand. So, and great outcomes. So that was a good one. That was a good example.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That was a good one, like you said. And I really liked you talked about physical activity as the one nudge. How can we try and get more people active then from minority populations?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think so. So we were talking just before we recorded here that you've got your soccer jersey on, your soccer team. You call them football, I assume.
I thought you were never going to mention it.
They made the final or something, or they got through.
No, it was like a final, but we stayed up. We're in the relegation, so we had to win today to stay in the Premiership, which for an Englishman who loves football, or soccer as we call it over here, is pretty big. So it was an early morning start at 4:45 a.m. and we were 2-0 down at half time, and just typical Everton style, we brought it back. We won 3-2. So yeah,
amazing. So, and in my little world, right, it's like I'm a Canadian, right? If you haven't picked that up, and
ice hockey,
yeah. So I play ice hockey, 2, 3, 4 times a week, sometimes if I'm lucky, and like that's, I swim, I had my time going to the gym, and I never really hit consistency with those types of activities because I didn't enjoy it as much as I love ice hockey. It might be a cultural thing, right?
I think
so. Like, I'm super motivated to go play ice hockey all the time. I love it. It feels like it's in my DNA. And so that's my own little bias here, right? But I think that if we didn't have infrastructure in place to support that, I probably wouldn't be as physically active as I am.
Right.
And as a result of that, or as a consequence of that, I would have a greater burden on the health system, particularly in the later stages of my life. And everyone else is paying for that. So at the moment, I'm paying for it through paying for my hockey fees, as well as all my friends. And the private market caters to that particular infrastructure need. In this case, there's sort of an ice rink up the road, and there's enough people with a sort of willingness to pay to do that, and that saves the society money essentially downstream. So we kind of, I suppose my view is there's a private public partnership kind of mix that's appropriate to target things for communities that is culturally relevant and appropriate to them. That, like, we know that we're catering to populations coming here. We know that underpins our housing market. It underpins our economy. It's 33% of all GDP is tied in some way or another to immigration. So we've also got to think more downstream about, well, we've also got to create programs and activities that get people physically healthy and well, so that we can we're not paying for it downstream in the health system as well. Yeah. So maybe that's kind of a nebulous way of thinking about it, but I think culturally relevant is important, and whether it's soccer for people that love soccer, or ice hockey, but it's finding out what communities actually want and need, and governments talking with private sector and creating an environment that's hospitable to a mix of ways of getting people active.
Yeah, makes sense, definitely. Let's start thinking a bit longer term, as you said, instead of the short term, unfortunately. But this brings us to the last question, Ajay. So it's a beauty, by the way, if I say so myself. But in terms of where you see yourself personally in the system, how do you contribute and influence it?
I think that's a great question, isn't it? I think I know the question's a bit personally. I think the organization I'm working for is very keen to bring people together.
Yeah.
And work through problems, facilitate understanding problems and targeting interventions to solve those problems. And I'm really passionate about that. So there's really strong alignment there in terms of doing that and assisting with that. So I think lending passion, enthusiasm, energy to that kind of model, I think, is really important. And there's a sort of a range of literature that supports that kind of adaptive approach to problem solving. And I've always kind of been passionate about progress, I suppose, and pushing things forward, and pushing, like, thinking about what we can do, like not just accepting status quo, but also pushing things forward, and how can I lend voice and energy and enthusiasm to helping others push things forward. I think that's kind of that's probably where I see myself fitting in, right? And it's just sort of maintaining that enthusiasm and energy, right?
It is, but it sounds like you've got a beautiful alignment with your purpose and the values of the organization that you're working for, and obviously your passions there as well. So I think you're in a great spot at the moment, and I think that the industry should be thankful for the work that you're doing, RJ. So thank you for that, and thank you for today. It's been great to speak to you. And is there anything else that we've missed or you'd like to share?
I suppose it depends on your listeners, but I think I think if there's if there's sort of anything to take away, is head down to your local pool. It's a great place. It's a great place to be. They bring people together. No, I think like I'm really keen to sort of celebrate aquatics and physical activity and sport and those types of things for what they bring to people's lives. And get out there and get moving. You'll feel better as a result.
Head down to your local pool. I love it. Awesome. Well, wishing you all the best for the rest of the year, RJ, and yeah, hopefully we'll get a chance to catch up in person one day. Yeah, thanks for your time today.
I'd like that, David. Thank you very much for having me on your show here.
No worries. Catch you soon.
Thanks.
Cheers, RJ.
Cheers.
Bye.